In the late 1960s, a new era of aviation was dawning. Airlines wanted massive, wide-body jets that could carry hundreds of passengers across the globe. To win this lucrative market, aircraft manufacturers were locked in a desperate, high-stakes race. But in the rush to beat the competition, one aerospace giant made a fatal engineering compromise. On 3rd March 1974, Turkish Airlines Flight 981 took off from Paris, bound for London. Just 10 minutes into the flight, an explosive decompression ripped through the aircraft. The passenger floor collapsed, severing the vital cables the pilots needed to steer the plane. 77 seconds later, the massive McDonnell Douglas DC-10 slammed into the Ermenonville forest at nearly 500 miles per hour. All 346 people on board were killed. At the time, it was the deadliest single aircraft aviation accident in world history. This catastrophic crash was not an unpredictable freak accident. It was the direct result of a known design flaw that the manufacturer, McDonnell Douglas, had been warned about years earlier. Instead of fundamentally fixing a dangerous cargo door that was prone to blowing open mid-flight, the company convinced government regulators to let them handle the problem quietly to protect their reputation and sales. It was a catastrophic failure of oversight, driven by savings at the expense of safety. The most chilling part of the tragedy of Flight 981 is that it never should have happened. The aviation industry had seen the exact same failure sequence unfold almost 2 years prior, but by a sheer miracle, nobody died. Investigations revealed that the very aircraft that crashed in France had paperwork claiming the fatal door mechanism had been modified at the factory, when, in reality, the crucial safety upgrades were never installed. How did one of the most powerful aerospace companies in America successfully lobby the government to ignore a fatal flaw? To understand the complete story of the DC-10, the engineering shortcuts, the ignored warnings, and the devastating consequences, we have to look at the fierce rivalry that created it. We have to go back to the wide-body wars. In the late 1960s, Boeing revolutionized air travel with the massive 747. In response, airlines asked manufacturers for something slightly smaller but still highly profitable, a wide-body jet with 3 engines. Two American companies raced to build it, Lockheed, with their L-1011 TriStar, and McDonnell Douglas with their DC-10. The competition was brutal. Whoever got their plane to the airlines first would capture the market. McDonnell Douglas rushed the DC-10 through development, focused intensely on maximizing cargo space and minimizing turnaround times at the gate. To maximize the space inside the belly of the plane, McDonnell Douglas designed the rear bulk cargo doors to open outward. This was a critical decision. Most airplane doors are plug doors. They open inward, meaning that as the plane climbs and the cabin pressurizes, the enormous pressure from inside the plane forces the door tightly into its frame, like a cork in a bottle. But an outward opening door has to fight that pressure. It requires an incredibly complex and strong latching mechanism to keep it from blowing open. And the latching mechanism McDonnell Douglas designed had a hidden, fatal vulnerability. The latching system on the DC-10 cargo door relied on motor-driven latches and locking pins to secure it against the immense internal cabin pressure, which could reach nearly 9 pounds per square inch. However, the design was tragically flawed. It was physically possible for a baggage handler on the ground to force the external locking handle closed, even if the internal locking pins had not actually engaged properly. Worse, forcing the handle shut would turn off the warning light in the cockpit. The pilots would see a dark panel and assume the door was perfectly sealed for flight. This flaw was combined with a second deeply dangerous design choice. The DC-10's primary flight controls, the hydraulic and electrical cables needed to steer the rudder and the elevators on the tail, were routed directly through the floor of the passenger cabin, right above the cargo hold. If that cargo door were to blow open at high altitude, the cargo hold would instantly depressurize. The pressurized passenger cabin above it would violently seek to equalize that pressure, resulting in the floor collapsing downward into the cargo hold. If the floor collapsed, the vital flight control cables would snap and the pilots would lose all ability to fly the plane. On 12th June 1972, this exact nightmare scenario played out in the skies over Ontario, Canada. American Airlines Flight 96 was climbing through 11,750 feet when the improperly latched rear cargo door violently detached from the airplane. The resulting explosive decompression tore a massive hole in the side of the fuselage. Inside the cabin, a grayish-white fog filled the air, and a section of the passenger floor collapsed downward. Just as the physics dictated, the collapsing floor jammed and severed the flight control cables. The rudder jammed hard to the right, and the pilots lost control of the tail engine. But Flight 96 had two things going for it. First, the floor hadn't collapsed completely, leaving the pilots with some limited control. Second, Captain Bryce McCormick was an incredibly skilled pilot. By aggressively using asymmetric engine thrust, powering up one wing engine while throttling back the other, he managed to steer the crippled jet back to Detroit for a miraculous emergency landing. Only 11 people suffered minor injuries. The NTSB investigated and found the design flaw in the latching mechanism. They strongly recommended that the FAA issue a mandatory airworthiness directive, which would legally force McDonnell Douglas to completely redesign the door. But McDonnell Douglas didn't want a mandatory directive. It would cause terrible publicity for their new flagship airplane and hurt sales. Instead of enforcing a mandatory fundamental redesign, the head of the FAA entered into what became infamously known as a gentleman's agreement with the leadership of McDonnell Douglas. The FAA agreed to let the company handle the problem internally through voluntary service bulletins. McDonnell Douglas wouldn't have to redesign the door. They just had to install minor modifications, like a small support plate, and add a small viewing window so baggage handlers could try to visually check if the lock pins were in place. This cozy relationship between the regulator and the manufacturer set the stage for disaster. The modifications were clumsy and inadequate. Furthermore, during manufacturing, the specific DC-10 aircraft that would later be sold to Turkish Airlines, known as Ship 29, had its factory paperwork stamped to indicate the vital support plate modification had been installed. But investigators would later discover it had not been. On 3rd March 1974, the consequences of the gentleman's agreement were paid in full. A baggage handler at Orly Airport in Paris closed the rear cargo door on Turkish Airlines Flight 981. He pulled the handle down, applying force, and the warning light in the cockpit turned off. But the lock pins were not engaged. He did not look through the newly installed viewing window, as the instructions were in English and Turkish, which he could not read. At roughly 11,000 feet, the pressure became too great. The door blew off. Unlike Flight 96, the depressurization on Flight 981 was catastrophic. The cabin floor collapsed violently, ejecting 6 passengers still strapped to their seats out into the sky. The collapsing floor entirely destroyed the pilot's ability to control the elevators, the rudder, and the tail engine. The flight data recorder showed the nose pitch down 20 degrees as the plane rapidly accelerated. The cockpit voice recorder captured the terrified pilots desperately trying to pull the nose up, realizing they had lost all hydraulics. Just 77 seconds after the door blew off, the plane crashed into the Ermenonville forest, obliterating the aircraft and killing all 346 people on board. The crash of Turkish Airlines Flight 981 sent shockwaves through the aviation world. It exposed the deadly consequences of the FAA's gentleman's agreement. Following the disaster, the FAA was forced to finally issue a mandatory airworthiness directive, requiring a complete redesign of the DC-10 cargo door latching system so it could never be forced shut without the pins engaging. McDonnell Douglas faced intense public scrutiny, congressional hearings, and massive lawsuits from the families of the victims. The company's reputation suffered severe, permanent damage. 5 years later, in 1979, an entirely unrelated maintenance disaster caused an American Airlines DC-10 to crash in Chicago, briefly grounding the entire fleet and further destroying public trust in the airplane. By 1997, a struggling McDonnell Douglas ceased to exist as an independent company, merging with their old rival Boeing. The story of the DC-10 cargo door remains one of the darkest chapters in aerospace history. It is a permanent reminder that when manufacturers prioritize speed, cost, and reputation over fundamental engineering safety, and when regulators allow them to grade their own homework, the price is always paid in human lives.